We are right at the top of the hour, and I want to say thank you to all of you who took some time out of your day to join us for our first in a series of Conversations That Matter, today featuring our distinguished colleagues at the New York City Commission on Human Rights to begin a very important discussion about New York City and our approaches and policy to achieve racial equity and improve the lives of not only our citizens of the city, but also our workforce who live and reside here as well. As we get started, I just wanted to talk about who I am. My name is Sakara Bay. I am the program director for WorkWell NYC, and I have the pleasure of introducing and moderating a discussion with Deputy Commissioner Brittany Saunders, who leads strategic initiatives at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. Before we get started in today's presentation, I would like to tell you a little bit about WorkWell NYC. I think some of you are familiar, but for those who are joining us for our first event, we have 4 major programming areas. Our first would be our Move More, our physical activity programs. Many of you participate in our online fitness classes or one of our biggest programs, September, that just concluded. And we continue to want to encourage city employees to make movement a regular part of their routine, even in a pandemic. Our nutrition program, our Eat Well program, really focuses on healthy eating and figuring out how do we nourish ourselves in a way that keeps us healthy, both in physical and mental spirits. Our Take Action program is really centered on primary care and prevention and figuring out how do we take care of ourselves before, during, and after with partnerships with our primary care providers. And our Be Well program, in partnership with Thrive NYC, really focuses on mental resilience and well-being. I would like to encourage you upfront at this point in time to think about how you can stay connected with us. We really strive to find points of information and programs that really connect with city employees, designed with city employees in mind. We have several social media sites, including LinkedIn and WorkWell. You can really join our mailing list that will take our programs to your inbox on a bi-weekly basis. And the team at WorkWell really works hard to make sure that we are aligned with interests and activities that really speak to the health and well-being of city employees. A little bit about Project Build, a relatively new initiative from WorkWell NYC, really designed to work in concert in response with the belief that health is holistic and you cannot experience racial discrimination and be healthy. In following with the public health professionals, racism is a public health crisis. And while we work with a very multicultural lens and diversity in our programming approach, we really wanted to be much more explicit about how we are building in these concepts, these conversations about inclusion, about diversity, about acceptance, about community, about all the things that make our city great. And this is the first program under the umbrella of Project Build. And this conversation that we're having today is hopefully one of many conversations and just the first layer of the onion as we begin to peel back these layers and really figure out how we work with you to promote, enhance, and make our workplace a better workplace. So we asked many of you before registration to really talk about what matters most to you in this conversation about race and racial equity. And just to reflect a little bit about what we heard, a lot of the entries were about changing perceptions about race to increase inclusivity and acceptance, the workplace and hiring practices and diversity of leadership, and how do you achieve upward mobility or the barriers to doing so. Lots of questions about ending systemic racism, the role of law enforcement and policing and community engagement. What would the city be doing about that? And lots of comments about children, including the educational system, protections for those who might need, who are vulnerable or in vulnerable situations. And I want to say, because this is the beginning of Project Build, many of these conversations are programs and projects that we'll be building in over the course of 2021. We won't be able to get to all of these in any depth, but we recognize the importance and seriousness of all of the contributions that were flagged. And we hope that you continue to stay our partners in this conversation to amplify areas that we can all contribute to working on building a better and different reality around. So to get us started right off the bat, I want to engage you in a little poll. The first poll, and please go ahead and click whatever options resonate with you. Over the past 5 years, what is your opinion about racial disparity in the city? Has it increased? Has it remained the same? Or has it decreased? Okay, so I guess. All right, so we want to close the poll. So about 75% of you agree that it has increased, and that certainly sets us up for a very important discussion today, particularly given the last couple of days of current events. We really want to figure out how do we begin inroads into creating a different reality. So with that, I am going to introduce you to Deputy Commissioner Saunders. She is the Deputy Commissioner for Strategic Initiatives at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. At the Commission, Brittany oversees projects related to racial justice, the intersection between city human rights law and emerging technologies, and other topics. Prior to joining the Commission, Brittany worked in the Mayor's office, the Mayor's Council, where she focused on issues related to broadband access and human rights. Before joining the mayor's office, Brittany worked for the Center for Popular Democracy, where as a supervising attorney for immigrant rights and racial justice, she was part of a team that successfully pushed for creation of a program to provide free legal representation for detained individuals facing deportation, and the Center for Social Inclusion, where she advocated on broadband access, transportation equity, and disaster and emergency policies from a racial justice perspective. Brittany holds a BA in sociology from Harvard and a master's in education from Fordham University and from Harvard Law School. We are honored to have her lead this dialogue and discussion with us today. And without further ado, Deputy Commissioner Saunders.
Thank you so much, Sakara. I want to thank Sakara and Victoria and the whole team at WorkWell NYC for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And I also really want to thank everyone who's decided to tune in this afternoon, because I know this has been quite a eventful week of a lot of things happening, many of them related to the themes that we're discussing today. And so I really thank you for taking the time to kind of join this conversation with us. The first thing I want to do is just tell you a little bit about the New York City Commission on Human Rights. We are a New York City agency. We're one of the smaller agencies in the city, but we've really been working over the last few years rather, to increase our impact and to increase our reach. So our mandate is to educate New Yorkers about their rights and their obligations under the New York City Human Rights Law, and then also to enforce those rights and enforce those obligations under the New York City Human Rights Law. So what is this New York City Human Rights Law? It is a very broad and expansive anti-discrimination law that applies within the 5 boroughs. It covers discrimination in employment, in housing, in public accommodations, which are places and spaces open to the public, everything from theaters to schools to restaurants, bars. And then we also have a couple other areas of jurisdiction as well. So one of those is something called bias-based profiling by law enforcement, which applies when an individual is targeted for law enforcement activity, not on the basis of a violation of the law, but because of their membership in one of our protected categories. And then we also have something called discriminatory harassment. So that's a rather unique provision that provides protection where one is targeted, for example, on the street by a stranger for what would be like a civil version of a hate crime. And that's been something we've been trying to amplify and make folks more aware of in recent years, sadly, as we've seen various targeting of various types of groups increase. But yeah, so those are the areas of jurisdiction we cover. But it's also important to know a little bit about the categories of protection that we cover. So the New York City human rights law is unique in its breadth. So we cover discrimination based on race and color, which are the sorts of things we'll be talking about today, but also discrimination based on age and gender and sexual orientation and disability and many other categories that you'll see in other federal and state laws. But we also go beyond that, and we have protections that you won't see in a lot of other federal or state laws. So for example, there's protections on the basis of conviction or arrest history in employment, or protections on the basis of lawful source of income, meaning folks who might use a voucher or something to help pay for their housing. Those folks should not be targeted for housing discrimination. So the basic take home there is that there are lots of rights and lots of protections under the New York City human rights law. And I'll say just a little bit about how we're structured. We have a law enforcement bureau that takes in and reports, takes in and investigates reports of discrimination from New Yorkers. That's staffed largely by attorneys. And then we have a community relations bureau, and the people in that bureau really do a lot of outreach and education with different ethnic and racial and other communities across the city to help folks understand what their rights are and what their obligations are. And then we also have a policy unit, and those are the folks that I work with, and we do things like look at legislation, push out rules to help people understand what the human rights law requires. We do special projects like research projects and hearings, which I'll talk about a little bit in a moment. So those are some of the three basic areas in which we work and some of the areas that the law itself covers. So we can go to the next slide. So I wanted to just spend some time in this conversation talking about how we've built and increased our work on racial justice and specifically anti-Black racism. So as Sakara mentioned in when she introduced me, I had worked on racial justice issues in other settings before coming into work at the city. And part of the reason that I decided to go to work at the Commission on Human Rights was because I knew that our commissioner, Carmelyn Morales, was also really committed to racial justice issues. And one of the things that we both wanted to do while here at the commission was really lift up the type of harassment and discrimination that Black people in New York City, which I think many people of you will have heard, even if your experience tells otherwise, right? That people often have this notion that New York City is this kind of progressive bubble, and we don't have the same issues with racism and harassment and discrimination and those forms of targeting that happen in other parts of the country. I think many folks on this call will know quite well, and from what I've seen in the questions, that that's not actually true. So we wanted to make sure that even though much of the discrimination and harassment that Black people experience in the city is often normalized, meaning that it's treated as something that can't be changed, or treated as something that is just a part of everyday life. We wanted to try to disrupt that a little bit through our work and through using our platform. So one of the ways that we started that was with our first public artist in residence. We were really lucky between 2018 and 2019 to have an artist named Tatiana Fazlalizadeh work with us. She is a Black Iranian woman, actually originally from Oklahoma, but has lived and worked in New York City for many years now. And she worked with us on a project that was focused on anti-Black racism and gender-based street harassment. So it was very important to her that the work she did was informed by the experiences of New Yorkers. So we worked with her to pull together these very simple postcards that ask people to share anonymously about their experiences with anti-Black racism and gender-based street harassment. We worked with the Department of Cultural Affairs and other community partners to put these drop boxes throughout the city. And then, folks filled out the postcards, they dropped them in, and, a couple months later, we collected them, and Tatiana used those to inform the work that she did. And you can move to the next slide. She also really wanted to make sure she connected personally with individuals who had experienced anti-Black racism and gender-based street harassment. So we worked with her to set up a number of community-based meetings with different organizations where she would talk to people about their particular experiences. So in addition to the postcard part of the project, she had these one-on-one, or rather group conversations, and that's how she kind of further developed the work, and then also how she identified some of the people who she eventually featured in portraits through the work. You can go ahead, Sakara, thank you. And I just wanted to show you this one example of how that worked out. So this is a set of display cases that the New York City Department of Transportation has set up in Harlem. And they were kind enough to work with us on getting Tatiana's work placed there. So these are a series of portraits of young women that she spoke with in some of these community conversations. And on the back of those, there are quotes and statements that came out of the postcards and out of those conversations themselves. And the point of all of this was really just to kind of lift up and make visible, again, experiences that Black New Yorkers were having, and to prompt more conversation around them, and more encourage people to be more sensitive to these experiences and to kind of probe their own their own role here, whether there's someone who's affected by anti-Black racism or someone who might, hear those sorts of statements expressed behind closed doors without necessarily interrupting them. So kind of pointing to the impact of that stuff. So we can move on. Another way that we tried to, again, highlight these issues and focus attention on these issues is through a campaign that we ran in the spring of 2019. We refer to this as the Wild Black campaign, and it was really inspired by a lot of the stories that we were seeing come across social media and seeing reported on the news and in newspapers about Black people both here in New York and across the country who are having this experience of being targeted for harassment and for intimidation, for calls to law enforcement, other sorts of interventions and interruptions, simply because they were doing some sort of normal activity, but just happened to be Black, right? And so that was something that ended up inspiring us to do this campaign. And so there's a series of images like this one. They are of people who are shopping while Black, working while Black, renting while Black, driving while Black, and walking while Black. And the text is what you see here. So, shopping while Black is a human right. And in the, I don't know if you can see it here, but in the ones that appeared more publicly, we had information about what the New York City Human Rights Law is, what the commission is, and how you can contact us. The other thing to know about this is that we ran it on MTA, so we were able to get it placed in buses and trains throughout the city during the spring of New York. Also appeared on bus shelters across the city, also appeared on the Link NYC kiosks that you might see where people sometimes charge their phones. And also appeared in print media, primarily in ethnic and cultural media. So again, another effort on our part to kind of lift up anti-Black racism alongside many of the other forms of harassment that people in New York experience. So we can go to the next slide. This is also another piece of work that I am really proud of and excited about. And this work began, again, grounded in things that we were seeing reported on the news. So the experiences of, Black people who were being told either in employment settings or in places of public accommodations, like restaurants or bars, or in other settings that they could not wear their hair in natural styles or other styles that were typically associated with Black people and Black culture. And so we recognize that because our New York City human rights law is so expansive and offers so much protection, that we could make a statement about this that, other folks and other entities for various reasons were not positioned to make, right? So we wanted to, and I apologize for the background noise, I don't know what that is, but we released in February of 2019 legal enforcement guidance that made it clear that grooming policies, for example, in a place of employment or in a bar or restaurant, that either on their face said that folks could not wear their hair in these styles, or that were applied unequally to different folks based on their race were in fact in violation of the New York City human rights laws protections on against race discrimination. So we put this guidance out in February of 2019. I'm really excited to say that we were contacted immediately thereafter by many, many local jurisdictions who wanted to see if they could do the same thing, pass a resolution of the same kind, pass a local law of the same kind. And we designed the guidance so that it had a lot of kind of detail and references to research and references to case law precisely for that purpose, because we wanted as many places as possible to replicate these sorts of protections for Black people who live within those cities or states. And then, of course, you'll have seen that because of a lot of work that folks like Assembly Member Tremaine Wright and other folks across the country were doing on the Crown Act, that there was state legislation that moved really quickly in other places as well that was along the same lines. And then the last thing I'll say about this is that we're now in the process of taking this from legal enforcement guidance to actual commission rules that would become part of the rules of the City of New York. And we had a great hearing a couple of weeks ago that was focused on this issue, and are excited to get our commissioners to vote on it and make this kind of a hard and fast rule and set of very clear protections for New Yorkers. So we can move on to the next one. And another project that we did that I'm really excited to share with you is a research report, and you see the cover here, on Black New Yorkers' experiences with anti-Black racism. And so this report was basically motivated again by our desire to really probe the experiences of Black New Yorkers, lift them up, and then point to areas where change was needed. And we see that as a really important function of the commission, and something that we've done in other areas as well. So we did a hearing in December of 2017 that was focused on sexual harassment in the workplace. And then we did a report that was widely circulated with some policy recommendations based on that. For this one, we wanted it to really be kind of qualitatively focused, meaning that we wanted to have it really informed by the voices of Black people across the city. So we worked with a great Black woman researcher named Tracy Pugh, and also through our different connections to community-based organizations, we're able to pull together focus groups that ultimately involved about 200 Black New Yorkers from across the city. These are folks who were African-American, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latinx, African, or otherwise identified as having African ancestry, or otherwise identified as being Black. And we strive to really get as much representation as we could and diversity as we could of folks based on age, based on ethnic and cultural background, based on their sexual orientation or LGBTQ status, in order to make sure that we were capturing a good slice of the range and the richness of the Black experience in New York City. And we did some interviews with leaders of different organizations, but the focus groups involving 200 Black New Yorkers from across the 5 boroughs were really the heart of this. And we asked them to reflect with us on their experiences with anti-Black racism, and then basically put that back out there in the report. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. And one thing that we also wanted to do in this report was to really dive into some of the history of anti-Black racism here in New York City. What you see here is something that we were able to pull from the New York Public Library. And it is a notice about an enslaved person, or I think 4 enslaved men who escaped during the time when slavery was in effect here in New York City itself. And just wanted to kind of lift up that history, because often it kind of gets washed away or swept under the rug, but it's a really important part of understanding what has made the city the kind of way that it is today. And a really, I think, important point to point out that things like Black codes and things like restrictions on how many people could gather and where, all of those things are not unique to particular regions of this country. New York had its own Black codes. New York had its own very sophisticated culture and apparatus of slavery. So you can go to the next one, Sakara. Thank you. But we also wanted to make sure that we pointed to the long history of resistance on the part of Black New Yorkers as well. So this is a record that we got from the Department of Records and Information Services here in the city. And it's actually one that speaks directly to the history of the commission itself. So I won't go into all the various changes and details, but what you see here is a telegram from Walter White, who was secretary of the NAACP. And he's writing Mayor LaGuardia in the wake of uprisings in Harlem that were in response to police violence, lack of employment opportunity, lack of educational opportunity. And so as, Black New Yorkers fought back at that time and pushed back in order to draw attention to the challenges that they were facing, the NAACP recommended to the mayor at the time that he create a committee to address these issues. And that committee eventually evolved into becoming the Commission on Human Rights, the agency that I work on. We can move to the next slide. But going back to the report and the feedback that we got from the focus groups that we held, the kind of underlying point that came through for folks was that for them, anti-Black racism was something that they were experiencing every day in many different ways, something that they felt was intertwined with their life experiences and just a consistent part of their life experiences. And the phrase that we ended up using to describe it was inescapable and emotionally taxing. So folks talked to our researcher about what their experiences were, and she noted that there were a lot of strong physical responses as people were retelling their stories and their experiences, a lot of pain and a lot of frustration, because of course these are very traumatic experiences that many folks have had over quite a while. And we can go to the next slide. Thank you. We asked our folks who participate in the focus groups to kind of prioritize for us, what are the areas where you feel that you've experienced anti-Black racism or, seen it or perceive it most intensely. And the top area was law enforcement. So folks talked about everything from, having the experience of being, stopped and questioned, the experience of being subjected to police violence, or also the experience of seeing, videos of police violence consistently and the impact that that had on them. They talked about larger trends across the board. So they very astutely observed the racial disparities in terms of arrests, racial disparities in terms of prosecution, racial disparities in terms of who gets plea bargains and the nature of those plea bargains, everything all the way through sentencing, and then the impacts of involvement in the criminal legal system on one's life. So, the way it can impact one's opportunities for future employment, and the way it can impact one's opportunity to secure housing for one and one's family. So many different observations at many different levels in that space. And the next one, next area that we heard quite a bit about was people's experiences in their neighborhoods and communities, particularly from folks who, shared that they were living in communities that were changing, that were gentrifying. And so folks talked about feeling like they were targeted for, again, in gentrifying communities, more law enforcement activity, but also feeling of exclusion in certain new restaurants or new stores, right? A feeling that some of these places are intended to be for newer, whiter residents and are not intended for me, or even use of public resources. So like a sense that things that had been customary to have a certain picnic or celebration in the park, now there was a lot of permitting, now there were a lot of calls to the police if you had these gatherings, and a lot of frustration around that. And then we can go to the next slide. And this is, if you have a moment, you can go to our video and take a look at this, go to our website and take a look at this video, which talks a little bit about some of this, an example of the type of housing discrimination that folks also shared with us when we had these focus groups. So people did talk about, being like looking out for or searching for a new apartment, and then being told by one's broker that the landlord isn't interested in having a Black tenant, or had these misconceptions about Black tenants. And so the story that I'm pointing to here in the slide is a story of an individual who had that experience and then came to the commission, which was able to help get him some relief. So just wanted to share that housing discrimination was also still a factor that folks shared as well. And then folks also had quite a bit to say about their concerns around education, right? And the concerns about their children in schools. Some of those revolved around, what they felt were the expectations that were held for their children in schools, or the assumptions that they thought folks were making about their families and their students' capabilities. But some of it went more to structural issues, right? So the presence of law enforcement in schools, the resources that are available to different schools, and how that impacts students' performance. So again, another really important topic that was raised. And then the next relates to health. We had quite a few really kind of, I won't necessarily say surprising, because I know many of us will have read or heard or even experienced, right, racial disparities in healthcare. But just, things like individuals who, felt that they did not receive proper diagnostic care, right? So for example, my child had a injury. We went to the ER for help. They, quickly diagnosed and said that they needed to do this really extreme, intervention or treatment in order to make the situation better. But I had, luckily I had an aunt, or I had a cousin, or I had a friend who's also a nurse, and that person, I had to bring them in to advocate for me, and then they ended up getting a much better solution. So just a lot of stories like that about folks having to fight and having to bring other people in to advocate for them in order to get the care that they needed. And then, so all of those are like things that came out of the report itself. And in a minute, I'll talk about some of the action steps that we identified coming out of the report. But I also want to just share a little bit about some of our kind of current efforts to really continue elevating these issues. So the image that you're seeing right now is from a public art campaign that one of our artists in residence just launched yesterday. It's called I Still Believe in Our City. Her name is Amanda Ping Bodhipakia. She is of both Indonesian and Thai heritage, and she has drawn upon that and her own experiences with discrimination and harassment to develop this campaign that is really focused on on one end, on the experiences of Asian American and Pacific Islander New Yorkers who've really been targeted intensely during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then also to express solidarity with the fight against anti-Black racism. And so she's developed these really beautiful images. If you happen to live near or be traveling through the Atlantic Avenue Barclays station, these are now installed there and will be installed there through this month. And then there'll be an installation on the outside of Atlantic Avenue Terminal starting in early December that also shows some of this imagery. So it's just a really beautiful way of countering those anti-Asian narratives, and then also countering anti-Black racism in a highly visible and I think really compelling way. And then the next slide talks about, or gives you an example of the work of our other artists in residence who were also incredibly excited to be working with over the course of the next year. His name is Andre D. Wagner. He is a street photographer. He is well known for doing the artwork for the film Queen and Slim. So some of the really beautiful, striking photographs that you might remember from when that film came out. He's been featured in the New York Times and Vogue and all sorts of other outlets, but he does these beautiful portraits that really capture people's experiences, and I think really captures the kind of beauty and the dignity of regular New Yorkers. So we are really excited to be working with Andre again over the course of next year to produce even more art that really helps people focus on and draw attention to human rights issues here in New York City. And so as I said earlier, our goal in doing the report was really to lift up the issues confronting Black New Yorkers. And now we're focused on the kind of actions that we can take as an agency and in partnership with our other agency partners and folks outside of government. And those really fall into three buckets. So one is policy tools. So at the commission, we can develop things that are as small as frequently asked question documents. We can do things like the legal enforcement guidance that we did on race discrimination based on hair in order to make clear what is and what isn't a violation of New York City human rights law. We can put out formal rules. we can do, we can even work on legislation with council or, with the administration if we feel like there is a need to kind of redirect the law or change the law or expand the law. And council has in fact been very active over the last few years in coming up with amendments to the New York City human rights law. So that is definitely one of the areas where we are now doing a lot of thinking, a lot of consultation with community-based partners in order to figure out, what are the things that are going to be most helpful for Black New Yorkers? What are the clarifications on human rights law protections that we can make that will help to, discourage some of the targeting for intimidation and harassment that we've really seen too much of. Another thing that we can do is that we can host hearings on human rights issues like race-based discrimination. So I mentioned that we had held a hearing in October on race discrimination based on hair and our proposed rules in that space. We're also thinking about other types of hearings on issues related to race discrimination. And often, a hearing like that will be followed by a report and then, different policy mechanisms. There's lots of different ways that we can approach it, but that's another tool that we can use to focus attention on these issues and to produce change around these issues. And then finally, there's outreach and education. And I really can't emphasize this enough. I have so much admiration for my colleagues in the Community Relations Bureau because to me, that's also some of the work that's so important is really shifting the culture around human rights and making sure that in New York, we can really model what it's like to be a richly diverse city, right? A city in which, contrary to what other folks would like to have you believe, we can have, people of color exercising leadership, and we can have, a government that works towards equity, and we can still be a functional, in fact, a thriving city. So that for me is something that I feel like is a goal of all of our work in this space, and something that I am, that's basically something that drives me to continue working in government. So yeah, I think we're going to move on now to some of our polls and our discussion.
Sure. So we have one more poll for our participants today, and we'd like you to vote on what is the most important human rights challenge for the city right now, according to your perspective: healthcare, housing, education, law enforcement, community economic investments, or building political will for racial justice. So we'll give you a few moments to respond to that. I know you only get just one. Sometimes life is like that. Well, let's go ahead and close the poll. All right. So, I think that this is very reflective of the comments that emerged in preparation for today's webinar. Law enforcement coming in at 35%, followed closely by healthcare, housing, and building political will. And actually, I think that this is a great segue to the next part of our discussion, which is about how do we create change? I think a lot of people on the forefront and engaging in this conversations want, experience it or consumes it through viewing, but just like, well, what do you do about it? So Deputy Commissioner Saunders, could you talk a little bit about how do we begin creating change through our own individual actions and collective action?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, and it's a really important question because I think it's important for us to focus on action, right? It can be really distressing if you focus on, all the weight of the problems. It's important to figure out how you can intervene. So I will say the first thing that I wanted to share here was the importance of, I would love for everyone here to follow the commission at NYCCHR on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. That way you can keep abreast of what we are doing at the agency. And, you can also contact us by dialing, 311 and saying human rights. There's lots of ways to reach us. You can reach our website, et cetera. So that's one important tool. I would say the other that I've been thinking about quite a bit recently is on, how can we all exercise influence amongst those we're closest to, right? So thinking about our friends, thinking about our family, thinking about the people who really kind of value our perspectives and that we have, these deep relationships with. What can we do to figure out how to help them understand what is necessary to bring about full and real human rights in this city and in this country. And related to that is this notion of being brave and intervening when we hear friends or family members say something that we know to be racist or homophobic or transphobic or xenophobic. I mean, as I think back on my own life, and I think about like the conversations and the difficult conversations sometimes I've had to have with family or friends, but also the growth that I've seen over time in terms of how people's views have evolved in a way that I think is really healthy and really inclusive and supportive of equity. I think that's a really important thing for all of us to be thinking about. As I think about like where we are as a country now, and some of the evidence we have in the last few days about where we are as a country, it really is striking to me that I think there's more that a lot of us could be doing to have those sorts of conversations and to challenge these sorts of attitudes and to make sure that we are modeling what it means to respect human rights and to respect the dignity of everyone. And I think all of those things are important steps. A lot of folks have also pointed to the importance of like making those connections between like marching and protest, which a lot of folks would have participated in the spring, but then also staying on top of like, what are the demands that folks are making? What are the policy changes that need to happen? And how can you be supportive of those organizations or those leaders or those communities? So that's always something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the comments that came from participants who attended this event was about how do we create the space to have these conversations. And I also like to encourage people to continue following Project Build, as we'll be continuing to provide spaces for dialogue and uplifting of topics that are emergent and important, and reflecting certainly those initiatives and topics that are driving some of this content forward into the forefront, and what really require allyship in order to actually make it work. I think that the Commission on Human Rights is very closely partnered through engaging conversations, collecting through focus groups, things that people really want. And if we continue to partner in that way, we can keep this momentum flowing. I think, so the discussion is, and I really wanted to touch base because I think that unless you were in a hiding away in some cave, I'm not sure if New York City has any caves, but you could not get away from the events that has transpired this week. And I think that this is not a political discussion, but certainly the events have become very polarized and created very racial tears in the fabric of not only just our country, but certainly our city. And I wanted to ask you, Deputy Commissioner Saunders, how do we recover from this kind of extreme polarity? Like, how do we build better and more cohesive, more collaboratively this community that we're really seeking, and really intertwine race and celebrate racial differences and ethnic differences in a positive way? What do we do with 69 million people having divergent views and another 69 million individuals in this country?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think, as you were saying before, making space for these conversations, kind of like almost like in concentric circles of influence, or maybe circles sitting alongside each other of influence. Like, I think it's incredibly important to normalize these conversations around racial equity in government in particular. And I think WorkWell is doing a really important piece of that work right now with this conversation and the other things that you're planning. And not only because each of us is like a member of this community in New York City, but also because as people who work on behalf of all New Yorkers, people who work in government, we have a certain amount of influence. It's important that we exercise, that we ourselves understand, what equity is and why it's important, and that we figure out how to integrate that into the work that we do every day. I also, we've been thinking about this too at the commission in terms of like, what is the right way for us to reach folks who, there are a lot of folks who are very open to the things that we have to say and the messages that we want to put out there and the values that we are charged with supporting in New York City. But there are others who are not necessarily so amenable. So we have been thinking a lot about like, what's the right way to reach into those communities and to create some safe spaces where folks can actually have honest, but also respectful conversations with each other. Because it really feels like the first step towards building this understanding and building more of this political will for racial justice is relationship, right? Like there has to be some degree of trust in order to provoke folks to actually listen. So we've been thinking about, is the right way to do that through more work with youth? Is the right way to do that through work with houses of worship? Is the right way to do that through thinking about like restorative justice principles and practices, like, circle practices where people kind of sit together on a consistent basis and share with one another and build trust and connection that way. So I have to say, I don't know that we have all the answers, but I think it's somewhere in there. I think it has something to do with working with young people and also something to do with, working with trusted community organizations to facilitate more of that conversation. But I do also think the commission itself has an important role to play in terms of like pushing those values out there, right? That's why we think the hearings are so important. That's why we think the reports are so important, is like, if nothing else, we can be a voice for inclusion, for equity, for dignity, and for respect here in New York. And if we can do that through art, or we can do that through hearings or policies or whatever else it is, then that's probably some of the most important work that we can do.
And I think we're going to collect, a few questions from our viewers or participants today. And while you do that, I have one other question about allyship and, how, the importance of being more than anti-racist, but if you're in the position to be an ally, what might be some recommendations to help, further this work along? What are something concrete that people could actually do?
So I have two major thoughts here. I mean, and I don't think they're going to come as a huge surprise, but one is, kind of first to put yourself in a listening posture, like really listen to your colleagues, your friends. If you don't have that many people in your own personal circle, then, do the reading, seek out those resources, because there are so many of them that I think are more widely available now than they ever had been, to help folks understand like the history of racism here in New York City and in this country, and its ongoing impacts and all the different ways that it manifests. It really is like, it's hard to think of an activity or a space or anything that's not associated with a racist history, right? But anyway, so learning about all of that and being a committed student of all of that, I think is a really important part. And then I really do think the next piece that's really important is to like be brave and to take those, your real asset as an ally is that you have access to communities and to people that, many of us, just because of the way that race kind of stratifies the way people live in this country, many, folks of color, many Black folks won't have access to those communities, won't have access to those spaces, won't have access to those conversations. So when you are in those spaces or you have access to those people, really being brave and figuring out how you can, challenge people when they are saying things that to be racist or to be discriminatory, how you can help them to think about things differently, push them if they're saying something is blatantly false, challenge them with historical information that to be true. Like all of those things, I think, particularly in the context of relationships, longstanding relationships, can help to move the needle.
Thank you. So let's open it up. Victoria, do we have any questions in queue?
Yes. So One of our participants asked, what are we doing regarding anti-Black racism within city government, i.e. within city agencies and internally? This is an area that I feel needs work.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'll say that like part of our motivation for doing the report on anti-Black racism in New York was to actually lift up some of those very issues. So, if we asked folks explicitly and they shared with us explicitly their experiences with law enforcement, their experiences with, the child welfare system here in New York, their experiences in other agencies across the city, experiences with the city public schools, because we recognize that racism is a structural problem, and city government is part of the broader set of structures that are implicated here. So that is part of what we did, is that we got that information, and then we actually went, before we'd even published the report, we went around to the agencies that were implicated, and we shared what people had to say about what they experienced. And so that's part of the process. I also think that, as I said before, part of the process is also normalizing conversations like these. I will say that getting that report published was a challenging process, but one of the most rewarding parts of that process was meeting with folks in various New York City agencies who are deeply committed to these issues and who are actually working really hard to try to figure out how they can influence the institutions they work for to address these problems. On the enforcement side, I'll say that I mentioned before that the city human rights law applies to employment, housing, public accommodations. That applies to private actors in each of those spaces. It also applies to city government as well. So we have folks will report to us if they feel that they've experienced discrimination in employment when working for a city agency. They've reported to us when they feel like they've been mistreated in a city agency that is functioning as a public accommodation. So all of those are also avenues that are open to people in order to report their experiences with anti-Black racism. But it's obviously it's going to take a lot of effort, I think, from a lot of different places over time in order to make New York City government actually, in reality, kind of an anti-racist institution or set of institutions and actors. That is going to take a lot of policy change, a lot of rethinking around budgets, and I think a lot of really concerted work like this to encourage those conversations, encourage people to kind of share their experiences so that they can be addressed.
And maybe let's take one more, Victoria, as we wind down the hour, and then we'll wrap up today's discussion.
Yeah, so there are a lot of really great questions that are coming in. I think one of the questions that I want to follow up with is pretty short. What is a good thing to post at your space at work or possibly virtually to help know that it's a safe space to express your concerns, especially with other colleagues or employees?
That's interesting. Yeah, like what is a good way to signal that folks should feel safe to share what they're experiencing or the challenges they're experiencing?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think it is probably a series of steps, and realistically, just thinking about our own experience at the commission, right? Because we are as an agency that's charged with kind of enforcing human rights protections, across the city. But we're also a workplace, right? We're also a place that has a very diverse workforce with people who have diverse kind of experiences and backgrounds. And so when I think about some of the things we've tried to do to encourage people to kind of feel safe, sharing their spaces is like, and I'll say all of this is a work in progress, particularly now that we're like in a remote setting. I think about, we try to create, we have conversations like these, right, where you're speaking directly to the issues. We also try to kind of, also along the lines of some of the resources that I saw WorkWell put forward, just remembering that our staff are like, fully rounded human beings, and that even though, they come to work and they have a particular function that they're fulfilling, in their job or in their role, that they're also people who are affected by all these issues that are happening outside. So like in recent months, for example, we've created just like a kind of regular spaces for folks to connect and to just kind of decompress, because this has just been such an intense year for everyone. We've tried to incorporate more restorative justice practices into how we run our meetings. We have tried to build in mindfulness exercises and to, you know, bring in folks who have expertise on that sort of stuff. You know, things like meditation and making just basically, I think to answer that question in a roundabout way, it's basically, I think it's easier, the more things that you're able to do that show that you recognize that your folks are human and they have a full set of needs, and that you are anticipating what those needs are, that you anticipate like when things that are difficult happen in the world and the impact that that's going to have on your staff members as human beings, that over time, I think that sort of stuff creates more trust, such that people will be willing to kind of engage in that way. I'm sure Sakara has stuff she wants to say about that.
And I encourage, I mean, this is a conversation that we're building together, and WorkWell is mission focused and being responsive to city employee needs. And as this conversation grows, I want to encourage anybody who wants to be a part of developing tools or programs that would really help the city workforce deal with this, whether it is signage to say this is a safe space. We want to encourage that dialogue. So feel free to follow up with WorkWell, send an email to our inbox. Let's grow what we want to envision for our city together. So there is no map, we will make the map. So I think that that's what's really exciting about it. And there are other questions. What we're going to do is collect those questions and try to put together something that we could share in a written format, since we're running out of time today. But I appreciate everything that was shared. And I really want to reinforce how important it is that we continue this dialogue and this conversation. And this is just kind of the very first chapter of what I hope to be many chapters as we all work to improve our own workspace and as residents and workers of the city where we live and where we work. As we close down, I just want to share with you some CREE resources. All of Deputy Commissioner Saunders' references are available on the CCHR website, and including the reports and the campaigns, or you might visit the Atlantic City train station this week and see some of the art installations that are there. Project Build's digital resources. You talk about how do you keep conversations going? Well, sometimes you can read about it and educate yourself. For those who are not big readers for articles, there are videos, there are podcasts, and also it's a community resource page. So feel free to add your own tools that you think will help further this dialogue to that site. And then whether it's racial trauma or any other kind of trauma, trauma is trauma and it's real. And the events of this past year has definitely been traumatic, from George Floyd to Brittany Taylor to Tamir Rice to Jacob Blake. And we want to encourage you to reach out for help and support if and when you need it. It doesn't matter how little or how much you need. So we just want to make sure that you get referrals to the EAP, to New York City Well, and to WorkWell's Be Well program, with a variety of resources that could help you and point you in directions, particularly the EAP, to some of those other areas that were flagged around housing, around education, and ways to create pathways there as well. What do we have coming up next in terms of WorkWell and Project Build? Well, there's a video.
From a global pandemic and racial injustice to political fallouts and a crippled economy. Introducing Art is Life, a visual showcase created to display the impact of this year's events through the eyes of City of New York employees. At WorkWell, we're putting out an open call for artists of all disciplines who work for the City of New York. This is an opportunity to express how you feel about the issues and help others heal. All artwork will be featured in a 2-week virtual exhibit where the public will be invited to vote on their favorite pieces. The artist with the most votes will receive the People's Choice Award and be featured in the 2021 WWNYC calendar. Submissions will be accepted November 2nd through 27th. To join the conversation and share your art, visit on.nyc.gov/artislife.
So we are actually reflecting the direction of the Commission on Human Rights and understanding that representation matters. And when we talk about furthering racial equity, what you see around you is really important. And we want to begin this art project for you to submit. What do you see and what are we hopeful for as we begin to build new pathways to better and brighter futures around race and ethnic diversity in the city? So I want to encourage everyone who might be interested to share this and to participate. Because we believe wellness is holistic and racism is one piece of the puzzle that impacts many other systemic factors, including diet and nutrition and access to supermarkets and healthy foods. We're continuing our promotion, particularly of diseases. November is Diabetes Awareness Month, and we're hosting a webinar on preventing and managing diabetes through nutrition. 1 in 10 people are impacted by this in some way in the city, and we want to make sure we get the word out because diabetes and heart disease and hypertension won't wait for COVID and it won't wait for racial justice, but it will help if we could be proactive and preventive in helping to manage disease and disease prevention. Upcoming, we have on November 10th in the kitchen, WorkWell NYC, a series of live cooking demonstrations with some of your favorite fall foods. So I encourage you to register for that. And a webinar with our colleagues from health and hospitals, really talking about how do you get and achieve primary care during COVID when the hospital or the doctor's office may not seem like the safest place to be. We're going to help navigate that with our health and hospitals partners. And I encourage you to visit our up and coming events page for registration information, or you can email WorkWell to find out all the details. Lastly, flu is here and flu is real and it is a virus just like COVID-19. And we want to encourage each and every New York City employee to get vaccinated. You can get vaccinated at an in-network medical office or a participating pharmacy, but we really want to protect your health, and getting a flu shot is one important way that we can do that. So I encourage you to get the shot and not the flu this season. And I just want to close with just a quote by James Baldwin as we continue to carry forth these efforts, and that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I think that that is very true about racial equity and continuing to uplift these voices and to continuing to keep these conversations going and connecting to resources and policy changers and advocates that can help bubble up the issue so that we can actually do something about it. I just want to take this opportunity to thank Deputy Commissioner Saunders for her time and information provided today, and to each of you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sakara, and thank you, everyone.